Europe is headed towards a demographic shift, and the European Union is actively accelerating this shift by adapting globalist immigration policies and positive discrimination or affirmative action social policies towards minorities, which are soon to be majorities in several major cities in Europe. Minorities are nowadays very generously funded, and they are being focused upon. Be it religious, national, or sexual minorities, the notion of their victimhood is being amplified, and the notion of culpability of the European for their socio-economic shortcomings is being pushed as a political axiom. After all, the official version of reality is that we are all equal and the same on all but the most superficial levels. According to our authorities, a utopia is just around the corner if we'd just be eager to give up more national sovereignty, traditional morality, power over our own thoughts, our earnings and freedoms in favor of the representatives of the rainbow technocracy sitting in glass and steel houses in Brussels. Our majority becoming a minority is something to be celebrated because it creates true diversity, and after all, diversity is supposed to be our strength. A Europe of European nations, dozens of nations and traditions doesn't cut it. A Europe of diverse philosophies is something to be reframed and reduced in the fold of the left, and a hollowed out dead conservatism isolated to questions of economics and cultural aesthetics without any true value base. A Europe of diverse Christian traditions is not just to be reduced, but something to be ashamed of and replaced with diverse religiosity, atheism, and ideologically confined versions of Christianity. Europe nowadays is not really diverse enough. We are, according to EU ideology, supposed to import diversity from abroad and lose the very concept of nationhood. Whiteness? Whiteness is a historic error to be corrected by means of ideology and economical change. Whiteness is in itself oppressive and should be wiped off the face of the world and history. That's the price we have to pay for a rainbow utopia, according to our ideologues. But what if I told you that you could peek into the future? What if I told you that there is a rainbow nation already existing right now? A nation created by visionaries of humanity, heroes like Nelson Mandela. Let us lift the whale of time together and peer into the utopia that is South Africa. With me, I have an important guest, Simon Roche. He comes from the Rainbow Nation of South Africa and is here to tell us what is to come to Europe if we heed the good advice of our leaders. He's the spokesperson of Sidelanders and I'm sorry, I probably butchered that. Sidelanders, an organization of people of European descent in South Africa. Simon, goeiedag.
Goeiedag.
So, could you tell us something about yourself first and the organization you represent? What moved you personally to do this, and what are your long-term intentions?
Very simply, I'm the spokesman for Sidelanders, which is a civil defense organization constituted under the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions were, let's say, adopted in 1949 after World War II, and their purpose was to govern the prosecution of war in the future. And in 1977, the international community adopted the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions as a sort of a way of closing up the holes in the Geneva Conventions concerning civilians, the circumstances of civilians in conflict, whether it's civil war or international war. And under those protocols, we as a identifiable ethnic group,
Yes,
which is what they make specific provision for, are preparing a national emergency plan for civil war in South Africa. What prompted me to get involved was the recognition, the observation over time that the new South Africa Rainbow Nation is not nearly what the if I may say so, sanctimonious countries of the Northern Hemisphere told us that it would be. Never mind what the ANC said. Never mind what the communists, the ANC and the South African Communist Party are more or less one entity, like Siamese twins. But the international community told us this was going to be a wonderful thing. And it became apparent almost immediately that it wasn't what they said. And it has since deteriorated very much. And I began to recognize that if you imagine it as a ball flying through the air, I could say to you, well, that ball is 10 meters from your mother's window, and after, a hundredth of a second, we could say, well, it's still 5 meters away. Maybe it won't hit the window. But with any common sense, you can see the trajectory of the ball is clearly heading for your mom's window. And it's going to smack the window and break it and maybe bounce inside and damage one of her vases.
So it's like a train wreck in slow motion.
Yes, exactly. There is a specific trajectory. And if that trajectory continues, then there is going to be a collision. And there is no sign at all that the ball or the train is slowing down. That things are going to get better. Not because I'm a crazy, racist, maniac. Any objective intellect can tell that there is no reason, no substantial reason to believe that things are going to get any better in South Africa. So we must assume that this trajectory will continue and prepare for the natural consequences.
Simon, I have to say something, because many people will be probably surprised by what you said, because as it is presented abroad in Europe, etc., it is presented as if South Africa was a very nice place with some racially neutral problems, but overall it's all peaches and creams and people live in harmony together, and maybe there are some historical errors to be reconciled, but people overall think it's a nice place there. So it's not peaches and creams over there, is it?
Well, if you consider, for example, that the murder rate, what they call the intentional homicide rate in Europe, is about 1 per 100,000. If you consider that in the USA, I believe that it's 4.88 per 100,000. In South Africa, it's 37 per 100,000. Now, people will, of course, say, yes, but black people and white people, die at similar rate. That's not the point. That's not the point at all. The point is that in this society that was supposed to be some sort of a utopia, we have massive rates of crime and violence. We have a declining currency. Our sovereign bond rating is one level above junk. The government has recently admitted that in recent years, 700 billion has been stolen from the government's account, as it were. So there's massive crime, massive corruption, a decline in the society. There are many areas that are completely unsafe. The number of protests in South Africa, that is to say the burning down of schools, burning down of universities, burning down of municipal offices, it is absolutely phenomenal. If anybody does any research on that, they'll soon see that in any year, it's many thousands of such incidents, not dozens or even hundreds, thousands. I'll give you another example which illustrates the conditions of the new South African Rainbow Nation. We have a miniature province, a bit like Washington, D.C. Not exactly, but there's a similar idea. It's a miniature province called Gauteng. It is the province in which the cities of Johannesburg and Pretoria are located. that province alone generates 13% of the GDP of the whole of Africa.
Mm.
That province receives its water from the Vaal River. Vaal means like pail or something like that. There are 144 pumping stations for drinking water on the Vaal River for the province of Gauteng. It means the place of gold. All 144 of the 144 are not working. Do you believe this?
That's terrible.
So I'm sure that there are many people in Europe who believe the excuse my language, but the bull dust that BBC and Sky News, ABC, NBC, CBS, the Tiger Zeitung, and all of these criminals feed them. But there is a lot more reality to the story. You know, when the murder rate is, well, 3,700% higher than the murder rate of Europe, that's not a beautiful place to be. I have in the side of my skull here some damage. If I press it hard, then it'll be painful for 2 or 3 days, where I was assaulted. I was chopped with an axe separately, shot at twice separately. My father was, again, these are all separate incidents, made to kneel in the sand on the beach and bend his head forward so that they could kill him. And one of my sons was accosted on the way home from school to be mugged. His mother's house has been burgled from top to bottom twice. Here we're speaking about one portion of one family. I could go on all day long.
Might I ask you, are people also specifically targeted for their race? Are white people the Boer?
Yes,
because you said
yes, of course.
that the murder rates are similar, but are they though? Because I don't believe that there are any exact statistics on this.
Tomasz, the murder rate, the black on black violence, murder, rape, robbery in South Africa, in the townships, is phenomenally high. They are places of chaos and anarchy and crime. However, if you compare the murder rate of farmers, then it's 4, maybe 5 times as high. The murder rate of farmers is something like 200 per 100,000. And these are the best estimates that can be made because the government refuses to release the precise statistics. And as I said to a journalist from the Times of London 2 weekends ago, I said to her, you must use common sense with these things. Even if you don't agree with me, you must use common sense and acknowledge that there has to be a reason why they are keeping these things a secret. They possess the statistics, but they won't reveal them. So what we're able to do with some common sense is to create highs and lows, a window in which the statistics reside. For example, the statistics pertaining to the murder rate of farmers. It could be above 169,000, 169 per 100,000, and below about 224 per 100,000, somewhere in between there. Nobody is sure. But 169 per 100,000 is high enough, and that's the minimum possible number.
That's terrible. And what I heard, it's not even because if in Slovakia you say murder, you imagine someone being shot. It's not really common. There was one journalist killed a year ago, and there was almost an uprising in the country. It was absolutely bonkers. So in Slovakia, if we imagine a murder, we imagine someone being shot or someone dying in a fight or something. But what I read about these things and what I heard from people from people talking about it, it was horrible, grisly murders. What happens over there? Because I want people to understand the scope of brutality that's happening in your country right now.
Well, you're absolutely correct. The murders are often characterized by the most unspeakable violence. I can tell you many stories. I can tell you a story of a woman who had, like barbed wire, we call it razor wire, wrapped around her neck and pulled tight until it cut through her neck. I can tell you a story of a woman who was tied to a chair, and the perpetrators took a drilling machine and drilled her through her joints.
It's terrible.
And then her ankles and knees and hips, and she eventually died. I can tell you the story of a 3-year-old girl who was raped by 4 men. You can imagine, not to be crass, but let us be serious here. You can imagine the size of the hole in question at the age of 3 years. And now she's being mounted by 4 grown black men. Can you imagine the pain? Can you imagine the tearing? The tearing open. Can you imagine how far that thing would pass up into her, given her little body proportions? She survived that rape. So they bundled her up in newspaper and poured petrol over it and set it alight. In the post-mortem, the autopsy, they revealed that she survived the rape. She was not dead when they put her in the paper. There is another story, quite a famous story, of a 4-year-old girl who was raped by 3 men while her parents were forced to watch. She was nailed, crucified to the kitchen table of the farmstead, of the farmhouse. I read recently about a man in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, a farmer, who was assailed by, I can't remember, 3 or 4 guys. He was an elderly man in his 60s, I believe. And they beat him down, and then they took a pitchfork and stabbed him with the pitchfork, and he didn't die. So they set him alight, poured fuel over him, set him alight. Another farmer, not so long ago, perhaps or a year ago at most, was tied up with wire, with barbed wire, and put into his pickup truck, and it was locked. And then they put petrol over the pickup truck and set the pickup truck alight, and he burned to death that way. There's quite a well-known story of a woman who went to fetch her child from Elon Musk's high school. Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX, South African. And she went to the high school to fetch the child in the evening. And she was grabbed by some men and taken out onto the field. And she was raped to death with a broom handle. But the stories go on and on and on. You know, we could talk about this for days. Just recently, an elderly couple, a man and woman in their 70s, were caught in their home, and they were tied to chairs. And the perpetrators saw that there was food cooking on the stove. There was a pot of oil for what? I don't know, maybe for French fries, I couldn't tell you. And a pot of water, maybe to boil potatoes, I don't know. But it was reported by the police, and it got into the newspapers, that they took the pot of oil, you know, they heated the pot of oil and the pot of water up, and they poured them in turn over the heads of the man and the woman. That's how it goes. This is the new South African Rainbow Nation. And these stories are not isolated stories. I could tell you stories all day long. It's part and parcel of our new society.
Is the government just trying to obfuscate a problem, or Did they somehow cause it? Are they culprit in the crimes? What do they do against it?
You're correct on both counts. They do obfuscate the problem because they don't want the world to know the true extent of the madness of the new South African rainbow nation utopia. And to some extent, they are complicit. They are culpable in a tacit and an active sense. Tacitly, they are culpable because they don't make the effort to stop these crimes that they should be making. And in an active sense, as Dr. Gregory Stanton, the head of World Genocide Watch, the world's foremost expert on genocide, as he has said at a speech in South Africa, I believe in the year 2012, I believe, he said it is clear to him as an expert. And by the way, he's a liberal.
Yes.
He's a man who adopted, he and his wife had children, and they adopted 2 black children from the Kingdom of Swaziland. So it's important that I say this so that people don't think that I'm drawing on the sources that are convenient to my narrative. And this is a liberal man who said that according to his scientific analysis of what is happening in South Africa, it is clear that the government is, his exact words I don't remember, but that the government is behind it, that the government has a hand in what is occurring. We believe that the reason for that is that the government is endeavoring to implement a communist revolution in a very slow manner, a slow burn revolution, and that one of the core revolutionary tactics is to get the opponents out of the country, to get the farmers off the land, to terrify people. And, you know, there's also anecdotal evidence. I don't want to give anecdotal evidence because people who don't live in South Africa won't appreciate it. It will sound like I'm making up my own sort of, or drawing my own conclusions. But we who know this thing and who understand this thing and who are familiar with this thing and who observe this thing know that there's something strange going on, something that cannot be explained unless there is an agenda. It's not random. It's not sundry or miscellaneous. It's intentional.
And as I heard, it's not just things that directly threaten lives of people. It's also things that threaten the economic livelihood of people. What could you tell me about systemic discrimination of poor people in South Africa?
Well, the government has a set of laws called broad-based black economic empowerment. And those laws are affirmative action laws whose purpose is to ensure that the society, the government, the bureaucracy, the business world reflect the demographics of South Africa. And how they work is that, let's say let us say that there was a contract to provide tires to the government's fleet of Mercedes-Benz. And you and I were both competing for that contract.
Yes.
I, as a white man owning a white company with white employees and white suppliers, would submit a tender to the government. And we would say, all right, we can provide Goodyear tires for $100 each. You as a black person would come along and you would say, well, I've got Bridgestone tires. They're not so good, but they're good enough. And they are $200 each. The government then uses a formula to compensate for the fact that you are black and you may get the contract. But in any case, I cannot even submit an application. I cannot tender on this contract unless at least 25% of my business is owned by black people, and preferably 51%. So what they will say is, well, you get one point, 1 mark for every percent that your company is owned by black people, and then you get a point for every black employee, and then you get a point for every black supplier. So what happens is that the man who sells the tires will only do business with the tire manufacturer that is black. And the tire manufacturer will only do business with the rubber company that is black. There's a multiplier effect that is absolutely devastating. It's very clever, highly intelligent. You must give these people credit for brilliance, absolute brilliance.
Well, in a way, in a certain way, but wait,
In their way.
aren't you guys a minority? Aren't minorities supposed to be protected somehow? Aren't there supposed to be minority rights? Or is this just about you being white?
Look, this is Africa. It's not Europe. You know, you guys hate yourselves so much that you're willing to implement these laws that are to your own detriment as citizens of your country. It doesn't work that way here. The minority is generally painted as the Goliath, as if we have some special potency, some special ability, or some special magic that will allow us to dominate 55, 58 million people. Look, Tomasz, in the real world is not BBC. The real world is not Angela Merkel.
The real world is it doesn't even intersect with BBC, I think.
In the real world, you protect your people. You protect your culture, you protect your identity. And black people are conscious of that. You know, as you know, probably the single greatest scourge of Western society, or let's say of European-derived society of the past 150 years, has been intellectualism. It has been the idea that you can absorb some knowledge and that makes it valid. As long as you can absorb it, it's valid. Even if there is no common sense whatsoever. None. Now, black people are not guilty of that. They're not prone to that. Black people tend to depend heavily upon common sense and wisdom. You know, you can convince a white person, a European, that Margaret Mead was correct when she said there is no difference between men and women. And there are no differences between races. You know, just some superficial things, breasts, whatever, curly hair. You will never convince a black person of that. Never in your life.
I have a creeping suspicion that even if we become the minorities in Western countries, even if it is projected then that in the US and in several other countries, people of European descent will become the minorities. I have this creeping suspicion that even if that happens, they won't be considered a real minority. It will be the leftists will find a bullshit excuse. Sorry for my language. They will find an excuse why they are still indeed being in power and why they are systematically oppressing the others, etc., etc. But
exactly, and they will feed you enough fluoride in your toothpaste to weaken your mind and your body and your will enough that you believe it, or that you at least acquiesce to it.
And
which is it's what's happening in Europe at the moment. What is very interesting for us as outsiders. Now, of course, we eat similar food to you. We use similar toothpaste. This is true. But the full effects of modern lifestyles on Europeans is not being felt quite so much by us as it is by you guys. And it's interesting for us to observe the effeminization of your societies. Every second person now believes that they are transgender, and they may be right. They may not be wrong. Because just think of it this. Look, I was reading an article recently on BBC about a man who specializes in making other men's wives pregnant because he's strong and his semen is alive, his sperm. He is on 114 children. The fertility rates of men in Western Europe are very, very, very low.
I know.
And this is at a time when people believe that they're transsexual, transgender, this, that, the next thing. Maybe those people are not wrong. Maybe they are right. Maybe they are not, the masculinity has been sucked out of them. And if you observe this thing closely, it's far more men who believe that they are women than women who believe that they are men. This is an attack on Western masculinity through the food, through the use of, look, I don't know if you know this. I'm sorry, Tomasz, but I just want to complete this point. I don't know if you know this, but you, in your whole life, have probably never tasted the meat of a cow. What you will have tasted when you ate beef is the meat of a bull. What happens is that when the animals are born, let's say you have 10 cows, and they all have little babies, and you've got 5 little bullocks and 5 little heifers. The bullocks will have their balls cut off because the testosterone gives a horrible taste to the meat. This is all meat production in the Western world. In the Northern Hemisphere, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, they cut the balls off. Then they feed the animal with synthetic female hormones, like a transgender. These transgender people, they eat these hormones, women's hormones, so that they get little breasts and so that their buttocks get bigger and their thighs get plump and they look girly, right? They do the same with the male cattle. They keep the female cattle one side so that they can reproduce the next year. They take all the male cattle, they cut their balls off, and then they give them synthetic female hormones. All of them, always. The reality is, and there are many more examples. I don't want to do all the talking. I want to answer your questions. But the reality is that our societies are being screwed up. This is a fact. The medicine that they use, the synthetic estrogen that they use to bulk up those oxen so that they get fatter and they can earn more money when they get sold. If you give those same synthetic estrogen, if you give it to the cows, they cannot fall pregnant. That's how bad this stuff is.
Well,
that's how easy it is. If you give female hormones to a female, she cannot fall pregnant. I'm talking about the cows now. This stuff is lethal. And that's what your children are eating from the day that they're born or from the day that they're weaned from their mother's breast.
But it's not just this. It's also nowadays hormonal contraception is so common that it is even found in drinking water, and also non-fermented soy. Eating non-fermented soy in everything. They say, oh, it's just vegetable estrogen. It doesn't affect anything. That's not really true. And also, also what you said, the women, they don't turn into men. They don't need to. Nowadays, the female position is so masculine in a way. It's so archetypically masculine that they don't really need to. They are dominant. They are depicted dominantly. They have quotas for being employed in certain places. They are protected by law. And they usually fall pregnant. If they fall pregnant, they usually fall pregnant around the age of 30 and more, and by then they are not really very fertile. That's another aspect. We tell to our daughters that it's a good idea to postpone falling pregnant, founding a family, etc., etc. It's not true because the climax of female fertility is, I think, around 18, and after that it falls down. So if we push this narrative of career women, of career mothers, that you have to study and get a basic career, and then you can have children, you get what you have, and that's a crisis of fertility in Europe. But that's a different theme entirely. Let's return to South Africa. But thank you very much for saying that. I really enjoyed what you said. Um, so what about the UN and foreign powers? Do they help? Does anyone try to help? Does anyone try to acknowledge the problem that has befallen the Boer people?
No, it's the last thing that they want to do. Remember, Tomasz, uh, the degree and the extent of the support for the Rainbow Nation that was given by the United Nations and the international community in the 80s and the early 90s. The last thing that they, and similar to them, the media, the last thing that they want is for themselves to be proven so terribly, terribly wrong. And that is the logical reason why the media is not reporting what is happening in South Africa on the scale that they would be reporting it if it was happening in Vietnam, Mongolia, Peru, Malawi, or Scotland. You know, there would be absolute hysteria. It would be on the front pages of every newspaper every day for years in a row, like the Vietnam War was on the front pages of the newspapers of the world almost daily for years on end. Um, they cannot be seen to have either been hopelessly wrong or to have been lying. Especially at this point in time when they have to urgently implement the globalist agenda in Europe before it's too late. You know, they must, it's a bit like a python. A python is considered a lazy snake, and in fact, in the Afrikaans language, it's called a luislang, a lazy snake. But when a python wraps itself around its prey, and then it clenches, it's the fastest of all snakes because it can't clench its coils slowly. The prey may get away. So now in Europe, the globalists have to push their immigration, homosexuality, abortion, and anti-Christianity agenda as urgently as possible to avoid a scenario in which Europeans begin to wake up in numbers that are great enough to oppose it. So right now, the United Nations and similar people will never, ever, ever, ever admit in public that either they lied or they didn't know what they were talking about. As far as the new South Africa is concerned, they have to pretend that it's wonderful, and they certainly won't be giving any help.
But I noticed that President Trump, he's a president on Twitter. President Trump tweeted something about South Africa, that something is happening there after the film document of farmlands made by Lawrence Sudden.
Yes.
Which is very good, by the way. I would recommend people to see it, except for one thing that I don't really agree with the ending, where she said that it's not already a genocide. It's a genocide in preparation. It's I believe the sixth stage from seven stages. The sixth stage is preparation by government, and the seventh stage is execution of genocide. So President Trump tweeted about it. Document has been made. Did did something change for you after that? Did the
No,
situation
nothing,
get any?
nothing changed. If anything, the intensity of what is happening in the farmlands of South Africa increased. But that also is not completely irrational or counterintuitive. You know, there's a good explanation for it. As long as the U.S. president is beginning to pay attention, it's like hearing the wail of the siren of the police car at 3 o'clock in the morning while you're robbing the bank.
Yeah,
You know, that's the time to grab the money and go. So we believe that there's a sense of urgency in what is happening now, and that's why we've spent so much time in recent interviews, in recent months, in the past year or so, asking people to donate money and to help us and what have you, because we're observing that there's a quickening of the pace of what's going on. What Donald Trump did do that was so good was that he brought this matter more into the light. It didn't change anything on the ground. The gangsters are working more frantically, not less.
yeah.
But he did create awareness, and we bless God for that.
Well, after this interview, I'll make sure to put all the details. But you can send me the details where we can support you, and I'll put the details in the video, and I'll try to organize a campaign to raise awareness and to enable people to support you, because what you are saying about what is happening is terrible. But okay, let's
Well,
go on.
thank you very much for
Uh,
that.
in Slovakia, we are way behind the state of affairs. Obviously, Europe lags behind, but not so far. The rest of Europe is substantially worse off than Central Europe
Yes.
in these affairs. I'd like to go back in history and talk about stuff as it happened in order, and as it looked to the people living there. First of all, was there ever a time when you lived in peace? Did the Afrikaner impose apartheid? Did the Boer impose apartheid, or was it someone else? And are you guys evil colonialists?
Well, apartheid, the name is an Afrikaans word, but it was not imposed by the Afrikaners. In 1899, the British invaded the Boer republics, or the Boer countries, for the fifth time, in pursuit of diamonds and gold. And after successfully winning that war in 1899, from 1899 to 1902, the British made South Africa a British colony.
Yeah.
And they came up with the system of laws to separate blacks and whites. Those laws did not exist prior to that. It's as simple as that. They were not created by South Africans. They were not created by the Afrikaners, the Boers, you know. They were created by the British. And South Africa remained a British colony until 1961, the 31st of May, 1961. And by that time, those systems were entrenched. to undo them was practically impossible. Um, without chaos, without the chaos that we're seeing now.
And what was life before it? What was life before the apartheid? Because I think that my theory, and I'm certainly not alone, is that people tend to live together with other people that resemble them, and at the same time, cooperation and cohabitation is possible, but tall walls make good neighbors. So, what was life before that? What were the interpersonal relationships like between the blacks and whites?
Tomasz, it's important that your viewers should consider that the black population of South Africa was very, very small 100 years ago. It was only once the British came in with, modern medicine, hospitals, mission stations, this kind of thing, that the population explosion was able to take place. And it's much easier for people to live in peace with one another when they are of similar size. There were more black people than white people, but it wasn't 11 to 1 as it is today, or 12 to 1 as we're seeing now in certain statistical data.
And what was the ratio before that?
Tomasz, let me give you an idea. In 1950, in a very famous census, that's not 100 years ago, but it's a census whose numbers I can remember, the black population of South Africa was just about 5 million, and the white population about 2 million. So about two and a half times, as opposed to 12 times. Now, prior to that, in the 1800s, the black population was proportionately lower again. It's very easy to live on good terms with somebody when they're not on top of you.
Yes.
It is true that people stuck to themselves, to their own culture, their own identity, their own language and traditions and beliefs. And
they did so freely, didn't they?
Yes. Look, there were wars and there were fights and arguments and what have you. There's no doubt about that. But nobody saw the need to implement the legal system that became known as apartheid until the British arrived. Then they wanted to collect taxes from black people, which the Afrikaner governments hadn't wanted to do. But the British were desperate, as they always are, for money, other people's money. And so they implemented a tax on every black African hut. It was called the hut tax. And that's where they began to identify the black African people as a specific group of people that must be contained in a specific place and permitted to do specific things and not other things.
I have to say, though, hashtag not all British, because some British are okay.
Of course.
A shout out.
Some of the most beautiful people who've supported us are British people.
Yes.
But I'm talking about a stereotype. I'm talking about the wars of occupation. I'm talking about the 33,000 Boer women and children that were starved to death in concentration camps. Yes. I'm not going to say Arthur and Michael and Fred and George.
Wait.
Name the name of every soldier. I'm going to say it's a British concentration camp. It was a damn British concentration camp. End of story.
Tell me, sorry, you mentioned the name concentration camp. I heard about it, but probably the viewers didn't hear about this in this context. In Slovakia, in Europe in general, saying concentration camp is really a triggering word, and it usually brings up a reaction of talking about the Second World War, etc., etc. So you said British concentration camps? Yes. Tell me more about that.
Look, I don't know. There may have been concentration camps in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Persia, ancient Babylon, but concentration camps, as we know them, were invented by the British. In the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902, the British were so anxious to get their hands on the world's largest supply of gold and diamonds that they sent 450,000 soldiers to conquer the two Boer Afrikaner republics. They'd already stolen the Cape from the Afrikaners, the Cape province. And they decided that they wanted all. Oh, and they'd stolen the Natal province as well. And it wasn't enough for them. So they invaded the Boer republics. And they sent 450,000 men, and they were opposed by about between 45 and 60,000 Afrikaner Boers, children, boys, up to men of about 70 years old. And they couldn't beat them. They got beaten time and again, the Afrikaners gave the British a bloody nose for a long time. So what they did was, to break the spirits of the Afrikaners, was they set up concentration camps where they starved the Afrikaner women and children to death so that the men would give up their arms. And it worked.
You people are really unlucky. Seriously, I don't want to be laughing about this. It's a serious matter, but holy crap, that's really terrible.
Yeah, the concentration camp was invented by the British. It's just as simple as that.
That's terrible.
Yeah, except that they were far more brutal. I'm not defending Nazi Germany. I'm not defending Hitler. Please, for God's sake, let no silly fool watching this, misconstrue what I'm saying. Yeah. But there were no swimming pools in our concentration camps. You know what I mean? Yes. They were brutally wicked. There were no redeeming features. There's no dispute over, whether there was ping pong tables or there wasn't ping pong tables. These concentration camps were beyond evil. The British concentration camps, implemented by the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Her Britannic Majesty's government.
Well, don't say that before you tasted the hospitality of a gulag.
No, for sure. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I just want to be clear.
No. I was joking. Don't worry. I didn't get offended or anything. I was just joking. And what was life like during the apartheid? What was life like on an economic and on a personal level during these years?
Look, I did a lot of work for the government. Just imagine if you were a road builder. Who would you be doing work for? In any society, people who build roads work for the government. Who else needs a road?
Yes.
Similarly, I was in an industry in which I did a lot of work for our government. And in 2008 or 2007, I was at a very famous conference at which the government started smashing all the chairs. Their conference, a government conference here in South Africa, breaking everything and breaking the projectors and the screens and the audio visual and the microphones and what have you. And I turned to a guy next to me and I said to him, "Why are your people doing this?" And he said, "Because the apartheid government gave us more than the ANC government." So it was a time without freedom for black people. It was a time that lacked opportunity for black people. But it was a time of stability, peace, a much higher standard of living, much greater life expectancy, much lower crime. I was brought up a Catholic, and one day at church, the priest, who was a Frenchman, was telling a story in his sermon about how when he first came to South Africa, the first thing that he noticed was that there were no walls between the houses, no fences. He said this was amazing for him. He said now, this was perhaps 20 years later, I don't know, in the 1990s, early 1990s. He said now the walls and the fences between the houses in South Africa is far greater than in Europe.
Yeah.
But when I first came here as a young priest, I noticed there were no walls in the houses. And that just shows you how safe our society was. Now, if you come to South Africa, you'll see everybody has walls, barbed wire, electric fences, razor blades, spikes, you know.
Well, I also heard that many African people from other countries actually immigrated into South Africa during apartheid. So right now, I don't think they are really piling up to get to a country. Before it was probably more safe and more hospitable even for the black people. So,
well, of course, where would you rather live, under apartheid in the 80s or in Malawi?
yeah.
In apartheid or Tanzania? In apartheid or the Central African Republic? I mean,
you don't want to live there in general. So,
no, of course not. I mean, this is to live like an animal.
and we get this image of Nelson Mandela as a hero. He is also always mentioned as this big moral figure, this larger than life personality that was this great humanitarian visionary. Is this true though? Who was he really?
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story. I was in a vehicle, a bus, what we call a minibus, traveling with some ANC people some years ago for work. And a very senior ANC person gave me a lecture on how Nelson Mandela, he said to me, did you ever notice how Nelson Mandela was unknown and then overnight he was famous?
Yeah.
He said that's because we identified the benefits of having an icon like the Irish Republican Army had Bobby Sands on the hunger strike. He said, we realized this is a good thing. You know, if we can find one person to be like the Bambi, the little buck, the Bambi in the story. Well, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That icon, that thing that you can focus on. You don't have to worry about all of the buck and all of the rabbits and all of the eel, otters and badgers, and you focus on one and you give it a name. And you give it distinctive little eyes, and you give it its own unique pattern, you know, this identity. And he said, we realized the benefits of that. And so we decided that Nelson Mandela was the right person for the job. He was tall, handsome, big smile. You know, in their eyes, he was physically suited to becoming this icon. So, number one, by the ANC's admission, not by my claim, by the ANC's admission, he was an artificial construct.
Let's recapitulate who the ANC are, because the viewers probably don't know that. It's the African National Congress, and tell me something about them, just to know.
Well, the African National Congress was the most prominent of South Africa's Black African liberation movements during apartheid. It was founded in 1912. But it never really got off the ground until it was until the post-World War II communist immigrant influx into South Africa. So there were many immigrants, communist people who'd grown up in communist societies who came into South Africa after World War II. Jewish people. This is not about you, but we are talking about Jewish people, whether you like it or you don't like it. It's not some anti-Semitic attack. I'm giving you facts. So Jewish people fleeing Europe went to Palestine and the USA, and there was a large influx of Lithuanian Jews into South Africa. And those people, those communists, brought to the ANC the acumen, the intelligence, the competence, the skills, the knowledge, the experience to make the ANC something substantial. So it was only from the 60s that the ANC really became a competent revolutionary force. African National Congress is the name, and the leader was Nelson Mandela. His wife was Winnie Mandela, the woman who was famous for murdering the 8-year-old boy, and who was also famous for encouraging her supporters to place burning tires around the necks of black people, not white people, black people, who did not support African National Congress policy.
What did they call it? The necklace of...
Necklace.
Yeah, the necklacing or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So Nelson Mandela was indeed a very shocking Marxist.
Yes, absolutely. People should remember that Nelson Mandela sat in prison not because he disliked apartheid, not because he was black. He sat in prison specifically because he was found guilty of treason for a series of bomb plots, one of which would have entailed him blowing up black people at Johannesburg Station. You know, the murder of black people. He was imprisoned for plotting to murder black people.
And he even didn't renounce it, I remember.
He refused to renounce it.
Yeah, they tried to offer him a deal, and he refused to renounce it, to renounce political violence, so he stayed in prison.
That's correct.
So, at least he had principles. They were bad principles, but yeah.
Yes.
Well. And so what is the role of Marxism in the transformation of South Africa? Now that we know that the icon is Marxist itself, is Marxism still a force to be reckoned with in your country? Because my country has a history with that particular ideology, and it wasn't really good. The first time Marxism was imported also from the West, from the Czech Republic, and now it seems that Marxism is in a different form being imported also from the West, from Brussels. So what's the role of Marxism in your particular case in South Africa policies?
I don't know how eloquently I can answer you because I'm not a political scientist. You know, the role of Suidlanders is purely to prepare for a civil war, which we believe is inevitable. So I'll give you a layman's answer. It has become apparent over time that the African National Congress is a wolf in sheep's clothing, that the African National Congress is devoted to a society in which any form of opposition to their philosophy must be eradicated. Marxism, you know, the African National Congress has a symbiotic relationship with the South African Communist Party. And in fact, very often during elections, the candidates, the African National Congress Party candidates, are not from the African National Congress Party. They are from the South African Communist Party. So you might say that the South African Communist Party is the ideological nursery of the African National Congress. The doctrinal development, or let's say the development of doctrine to pragmatism, comes out of the South African Communist Party. They take Marxist principles and they instruct the ANC how to implement them in practical ways, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah, many of the leading minds within the African National Congress and its allies come from the South African Communist Party. It is the intellectual nursery of that nexus.
So, and okay, let's go down to earth now, because I asked ideological questions a lot. After the apartheid, did you guys believe things would turn out to be good? Did people believe in this rainbow nation notion? I mean, specifically Boer people.
Perhaps I can answer you this way. I'll use myself to illustrate the point. There is massive resentment amongst conservative Christian Caucasians. The right wing of South Africa, against those white people who voted yes in the famous referendum of 1992 concerning transition. So there was a referendum. The government said, do you want us to continue to work towards a solution, blah, 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 Nelson Mandela, utopia, happiness, joy, love, you know, all of this kind of stuff. Yes or no? And today, conservative Christian Caucasians hate those people who voted yes. I was one of those people who voted yes. Because at the time, it seemed apparent to me that there was no option. It was either to continue with the system of apartheid, which was clearly not working. Our inflation rate was going up. We had universal sanctions imposed upon us. Let me tell you, universal sanctions is something that has to be experienced to be understood.
That's no joke.
And so I'm one of those people who believed that the lesser of the two evils was for us to attempt to find another way, to work together, to see if the Rainbow Nation, the multiculturalism, the miscegenation, etc., was indeed feasible. Of course, it's turned out not to be very feasible, but I'm not sure that I would do things differently if I was given the opportunity to do them again, because there wasn't a third option on the table. Federalism was not, it was rejected as an option by the ANC and the apartheid government. An ethno-state, a homeland, as separate from federalism, was rejected as well. What was the choice? What was the option? To me, it seemed good to try something new.
Oh, well, we are usually put in front of package deals, and we have to choose from two bad options. That's the nature of politics, because our politicians aren't on our side, but that's probably a different theme altogether. So after this happened, how did everyday life gradually change? What were the first visible, palpable signs in everyday life? What were the gradual changes in interpersonal relationships? What were the first signs that things aren't going really the way they should be going?
Well, I don't know if interpersonal relationships is the portion of the question to which I can respond most easily, but let me try to answer you this way. The first things that we started to hear about was the conditions in the hospitals. The hospitals, which had previously been segregated between black and white, reports started to come very, very soon, very, very soon in the newspapers of this hospital is broken, that hospital, the nurses are not working, in the other hospital, all of the sheets from the beds have been stolen by the staff. In that hospital, the medicine is missing, etc. Then it began to creep into education. And there was a radical decline in the levels of education. Then we began to hear stories of government theft, in big deals.
Yeah.
Maybe in a deal to buy some ships or some fighter jets or submarines. It would turn out that the government stole 10% or 20% of the money. And then the crime began to increase. By the late 90s, the crime on the streets was very bad. And then you started to see more and more and more and more the conditions of the towns. Filthy, filthy, filthy. No road repairs. Municipal and governmental buildings in a poor state of repair. Those were the signs, I think, that stood out the most and the earliest.
And right now, after the gradual decline that happened, and it happened, as you said, the first signs were really fast. What is it like for a parent to raise children in South Africa? For a Boer parent to raise children in South Africa right now?
Well, it can be very difficult because the price of education has gone very, very high. And I think that many people are afraid of harm coming to their children. And of course, because of the black economic empowerment or affirmative action laws that I described to you earlier, with their multiplier effect, many people leaving school just can't get jobs, and there's no prospect of them getting jobs. So it's become quite a worrying thing. Many people are sending their children overseas if they can afford to do it, or they as a family are immigrating, or the children are saving up money, and as soon as they can, they're going to Europe to look for jobs. It's not easy, but this is what people want to do.
And what are the everyday relationships between blacks and whites? Are there any?
Yes, there are. There are many people who still believe in the new South African Rainbow Nation, many white liberal people who spend a lot of time in very healthy, productive relationships with black people. That doesn't mean that everything's working. It means that just as we've had a huge electricity crisis this year because our government cannot run an electricity supplier, that doesn't mean that some black people and some white people are not friends at university or whatever. The new South African Rainbow Nation has not completely fractured yet.
And how? Because you told me about the parties which are usually the representatives of blacks. Is there any major political force nowadays that at least tries to incorporate the interests of white people in South Africa?
I'm glad that you used the caveat or the qualifier, at least tries to, because that makes it easy for me to say, yes, there is one fairly big party. It is the official opposition in our parliament. It is a party that is supported by black people, white people, colored people. That means mixed race people in our language. Indian people. We have a very large population of Indian people in South Africa who came here 140 years ago. It represents everybody. It's voted for by everybody, but it is white dominated. And there is also a smaller party which is more representative of the Afrikaners. And that party has done quite well in the recent elections of last week, the 8th of May, Wednesday, the 8th of May. But they don't change anything. They try, but they don't change anything. It's very difficult to stop the train of the ANC.
Well, in a universal democracy, it's really hard to beat demography. It's intertwined. If a bloc is voting just on the base of ethnic interests, and another bloc is voting only or mostly in the lines of ideological lines. The one who's trying to be universal always loses, especially when they are the minority. So okay, we can pick off where we stopped last time. So,
Okay.
what is the best and worst thing you'd expect in the future? Is there a master plan from your part, or from the part of Southlanders?
The best thing that we can expect from the future, or hope for of the future, is a sane, sober, decent, respectable society for our people to live according to our traditional values, and to be able to work and prosper as our people are accustomed to doing.
Yes.
The worst thing that we can expect of the future is a gradual decline of South Africa's society for another 2 or 3 or 4 years, in which more women are raped, more farmers are murdered, more land is stolen, more crimes are committed in the suburbs, more cars are hijacked at stop streets and at traffic lights. A continual deterioration in the standard of education of our children, and a continual deterioration in the standard of the health services provided by our government. If that goes on for another 2 or 3 years, it would be just intolerable. People are already finding it impossible to cope with the madness, you know.
And is there a
Do we
master?
have?
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yes. As far as the master plan is concerned, we don't have a plan beyond civil war. Our plan is to withdraw behind certain lines into a certain geographical area, and there to besides defending that area, to build within that area a sustainable society with adequate clean water, abundant electricity, sufficient food, and law and order.
Well, law and order is something something your people can probably create for themselves better than the current government.
Well, yes, of course. You know, if there was a civil war tomorrow, it would not be a good thing. It would be terrible. Imagine the children being raped and having their brains bashed out, and all of these things that we know and understand here in South Africa. But it is true that within our safe zone that I described to you, our safe area or green zone, we will be able to ensure law and order as a bare minimum.
Well, I wish you luck in that, and not just I don't just wish you luck. I want to help in any way I can, and I want to move other people to help you as well. So it's very important. It's very important not just for the Boer, but also for Europeans wherever they are, because as I see it, this is not just an issue of South Africa and your people. This is just a vanguard of an overall attack on Europeans anywhere. And I think that your war is ours as well, whether we know of it or not. And what is the best and worst thing you'd expect in Europe? And what would you say to European politicians and academic elites? What do you predict for us?
We are somewhat pessimistic. I'm sorry to say this, Tomasz, but I would prefer not to be dishonest with you. I would prefer not to say the things that you and your people want to hear. I would rather be honest, and perhaps we will be wrong. God willing, we will be wrong. But we believe that Europe has sacrificed so much of her integrity that it will be difficult, if not impossible, to recover it, unless there is a catastrophic event. If there is some sort of catastrophic event which galvanizes the unity of Europeans to protect their values, their norms, their laws, their traditions, and their culture, if, for example, there was a civil war in Europe between the traditional Europeans and, let's say, the madness, the liberals, the Muslims, the outsiders, the people who do not.
They are not really liberals anymore, I think.
Well, you know what I mean. The liberals and.
They are more like authoritarian nihilists at this point.
Well, that's true. That is true. If there was such a crisis, it would give you right-hearted people the opportunity to come together. You would be inspired to look after one another and to defend what you believe in. If that doesn't happen, your birth rates are going to work against you. Your open borders are going to work against you. The unison of your opponents is going to work against you, because you vote center right, I vote right, our friend votes moderate right, or, even if you're right wing, you're voting for 9 different parties.
Yeah.
The Muslims vote for one party. That is the party that represents their interests the most. Boom. So they only have to be 20 or 25% of the population to dominate your politics.
As we see it, I'm sorry. As we see it, as we look at it in Netherlands and in Germany as well, they vote for a left-wing party that pretends to represent their rights. That's the first phase, and in the second phase, they found their own parties, which are not left-wing but are Muslim. So,
yes, of course. And we've been warning you guys of this for years, but you thought you were clever and we were stupid, with respect. We have been saying this is the way that it works. We come from a multicultural society. We have observed this. Nobody would listen. With respect, please, with respect. But we have tried to help people to understand that any entity, whether it's black or Muslim or Chinese or Vietnamese or Korean, that has an identity that is different to yours, is not going to sacrifice that identity to put a smile on your face. It's going to retain its identity. This is a fundamental principle.
Yes.
If it retains its identity, and if it acts cohesively, it doesn't matter how big the wall is. If the wall is made of polystyrene, the fist will break it. And the walls of value, the walls of culture, the walls of tradition, the walls of religion, the walls of norms and mores, to use the legal terms, in Western Europe, or in Europe generally, are now made of polystyrene.
Yeah.
They are fragile. And they are even frail.
And it is not just that they retain their identity. We actually actively erode our own identity, and we actively support foreign identities in our countries.
Yes.
Because we even feed the victim complex of minorities in our countries, and this in a synergy. Maybe someone could someone could rationalize that if you erode the identity of absolutely everyone, maybe they could rationalize, try to rationalize that um, it it might work in some weird way. But if they erode their own identity, the identity of their own team, and they support and strengthen and finance the identity of everyone else, and they actively support splinter groups within themselves.
Yes,
It's a negative synergy. It's a terrible effect.
of course, and it's astonishing to see how Europeans have been beguiled into this thing. It's a bit like we talk about growth rates and so on. One of the most egregious for us examples of what we would see as Northern Hemisphere madness is that your politicians say to you that you should not breed too much because of overpopulation, a food crisis, World Health Organization, United Nations Children and Education Funds. They whip out all of these entities and their acronyms and the catchphrases and the slogans. And so you stop breeding. Then they take your tax money to open maternity clinics in Uganda. Excuse my language, but it is unfucking believable that any human being could be so damn stupid. They tell you not to make babies with your women. They tell you not to make babies with your women. And they tell you to cut the life out of your woman's womb. To cut the life out of her womb. Then they take your tax to open maternity clinics all throughout Africa, all throughout Asia, and all throughout South America. How can you be so damn stupid?
Well, this is what I ask every day when I read the papers. It's terrible.
How did they do it? How did they get it right, Tomasz? How did they convince you people in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, not to say that we are perfect? Don't forget, many of South Africa's problems are precisely because of the liberals and the academic elite and so on within our own culture. So it's not to say that we as white South Africans are perfect and the rest of the white people of the world are idiots. No, we have messed up something phenomenal. But I can be wrong. I can be guilty of robbery and you can be guilty of theft. We can each have a weak point. I can be ugly and you can be fat, But today we are talking about you, or in this moment.
In this moment, yes. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with you. But the bright side for me is that Central Europe is a little bit different than the rest of Europe. We resist. You see what's happening with Orban and with the Poles. Recently, I've been in Poland. It was a great mass, a Catholic mass, and actually hundreds of people came, and the priest actually preached nationalism. He actually preached. Sorry?
I say, wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And people with anti-communist flags were there, and they held it, and it was beautiful. It was beautiful, and this is something we have, and the West doesn't have.
Yes.
They try to infect us. Soros funds NGOs all over Europe, including our country. Open society is a thing in our country, but still, people in Slovakia, people in the Czech Republic, people in Poland, people in Hungary, they are still sane, and they don't buy into this bullshit. Maybe the ruthless cosmopolitan types they do, but as a nation, it's widely popular to hold a very reserved position towards multiculturalism.
Yes.
Even the mainstream partially doesn't subscribe to it. Okay, let's move forward. So, if the political climate in Europe shifts towards sanity, let's go with the good option in the near future. What push could be done from the EU to help you concretely in your country?
Really, if that fairy tale was to come true, the thing that we would appeal for is financial support for the work that we're doing. It's always, well, for me, it's always difficult to talk about money because it sounds like an American evangelical pastor, But we don't lack numbers. We have a fantastically strong organization in terms of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. We don't lack a plan. We don't lack experience and training. The one weakness that we do have is the finance. We have for some years now boxed above our weight. We're lightweight. We're a small nation at the far end of the world with relatively speaking, low numbers, high numbers as a proportion of our people. Yes, big organization, but we're not a nation of hundreds of millions of people. So we have been kind of a lightweight organization boxing at middleweight or light heavyweight. We've really we've done our share. We believe, we would like to believe, we have done our share. We have made a fair contribution to the struggle of recent years to lift up the standard, like an army battle flag, to raise the standard for conservative Christian, or the conservative Christian cause. And now we are appealing to people to consider that we are part of the fight. We are the youngest brother, maybe. We're the smallest, maybe, but we are fighting very, very hard. And we are crying for people to support us, quite honestly.
Yes. Also, I believe that diplomatic pressure would also somehow it could help, but not absolutely. I think that to be frank to you, I think that the catastrophe can be postponed. It can be slowed down, and you can be helped. But in the end, a conflict will happen. It will have to happen, and I want, my wish for you is to be prepared and to be strong and to remain strong. Okay.
And it's those preparations, the material, physical preparations, that are our weakest aspect.
Yes.
When I was telling you earlier, what we need is finance, and that is our thing. Mentally, we are well prepared in terms of training and what have you. Our preparation is good. It is the physical, material preparations that are our weakness. And you're right. This thing can maybe slow down a little bit. But it's now inevitable. I spoke to you previously in part one of this series of 2 interviews about certain of the aspects of what is happening in South Africa. You can't fix that. It's now at the point where even the Chinese are not giving loans, refusing to give loans. And the Chinese will give loans to anybody, providing that you use part of your country, part of your resources as collateral, whether it's a port or a power station or an airport or a railway or a mine or whatever. Now the Chinese are even declining loans to South Africa because even the Chinese can see that things are very severe. You are right. What is happening in South Africa will lead to a crisis. Maybe diplomatic pressure will have some effect, but so far it's had no effect whatsoever. Not in any regard. I can tell you that letters have been written by the ambassador of the Netherlands, and Donald Trump has done tweets, and those things
That's
are,
all he ever does these days, I think.
and those things have been good for raising awareness, but they have not changed what is happening in South Africa at all. On the contrary, they have made things worse, because every time that occurs, the government and the other left-wing parties become more revolutionary. They say, well, now we are definitely going to do X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C,
They directly threatened genocide during the strike, I believe.
Yes,
so directly threatened it.
Yeah, so we don't say that there shouldn't be ambassadorial pressure, but we do say, don't think it will make things better. It will make things worse, because it's like the tortoise going into the shell. When the international community says anything sensible, then the ANC becomes more radical.
Well, also, I believe that globally things will pick up, they will accelerate, because the economic indicators aren't so well globally. No. And
yes.
when a crisis hits, all those weak links within society that are only held together by this fake prosperity.
Yes.
It's a bubble, and when the bubble pops, when the bubble finally pops, the emperor will visibly have no clothes, and all those fake relationships, fake consistency within societies, it will break down, and the naked reality will look at us in the eye, and it will be terrible for many people that make
illusions. You are correct. You are correct. I'm not an economics expert, but recently I've been doing a fair amount of research into the potential for a global economic collapse, and watching videos and doing some reading and listening to people who know what they're talking about. And it seems now as if it's more or less inevitable that something very big is going to happen. And I think that they can artificially inflate the bubble to some extent, but that the I don't know how to put this, but whatever capacity they had for an artificial inflation of this fake prosperity is being used up.
Yeah, it's diminishing returns from.
Well, diminishing returns, and also fundamentally a diminishing reserve.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that at some point something big is going to happen, and if it does happen, I think that Europe will suffer more than most. We in South Africa will have it very, very hard. And the North Americans will have it very, very hard. But Europe is going to suffer the most, because it's not a large place, but there is a fairly large number of people.
Yes.
The population density is great. There are few resources, and there are going to be many hungry, frustrated, angry, desperate people competing for very little once that fake prosperity has been removed, as you correctly say.
And even if let's imagine this Candyland, this La La Wonderland. Even if we somehow maintain economic prosperity, and the economy reaches a point where the AI and automation gets so fantastically productive that you can produce so effectively that almost no physical labor is required, and almost no human input is required. Okay.
Yes.
let's go back. Let's go back to the first industrial revolution.
Yes.
What has the first industrial revolution produced? Two world wars during the change, two world wars and totalitarian ideologies. Um, it has produced a lot of catastrophes, and uh, nowadays, because of the regulations, because of the rigid contractual obligations of large entities that practically rule the economy in Europe and in America, the economy has become very rigid, and if this drastically changes, even in a good way, even in the way of absolute prosperity, almost post-scarcity, it will produce a social turmoil that will rock the world. Um,
Yes.
even if it all goes well, even if it all goes well economically, we will reach a point where the social pressures alone will produce a crisis, as they have in the past. So, yeah.
Yes.
Uh,
I cannot disagree with you. The reasoning is sound.
when I, I looked you up everywhere where I could, and of course, there are leftist outlets, and also Wikipedia says that you are a racist group. Wikipedia seems to think that you are racist, evil racist. What can you tell me about that? Are you a Nazi?
No, no. Uh, I don't think that anybody who is a Nazi or who is a sentimental racist, somebody who enjoys the emotions of hating other people,
Yeah.
um, would have done what I have done in my adulthood, working hard for the new South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, living amongst black people, which is something you cannot hardly find in South Africa, particularly in those days. I know what lies on my heart. I don't have a particular hatred for gypsies or Jews or Mongolians. I just really don't care about them enough to hate them. The same applies to black people.
Yeah.
Uh, but I am a patriot. I love my mommy and I love my daddy. I love my language and I love my culture. I love my history and I love my traditions. I love the instincts inside of me. They're not perfect, but I love them. It would be nice if I was more industrious, like a South Korean or a Chinese, if I had this kind of oriental fascination with hard work for its own sake almost. But for better or for worse, I love my identity.
Yes.
And Suidlanders, I think, I think I am a microcosm of Suidlanders. We are not an organization that is, we are introspective.
Yes.
For us, it's not about the fact that we didn't pay our neighbors' children's school fees. It's got nothing to do
Yes.
with not paying your neighbor's children's school fees or not buying a dress for your neighbor's wife. It's got to do with in your own home. Did you do the best for your children? Did you look after your wife? Did you pay their school fees and did you give them healthy food? It's introspective.
Yes. I think that we finally have to stop to be ashamed of being on our side, our
Yes.
own side, and yeah. So, and in preparation for this talk, I have seen many of your presentations and interviews online. What strikes me as beautiful and inspirational is the energy and readiness you seem to radiate despite the dire odds. in Slovakia and Europe in general, we are facing government censorship and organized propaganda in the school and in the media. Many people are already afraid or seem hopeless. I'm not one of them, but I won't refuse some good advice for worse times. So how do you keep your spirit, Simon? And what should people in Europe do in preparation for the massive changes that are coming? And that should be my final question.
Tomasz, I should be honest with you and tell you that my spirit is perhaps at the weakest that it has ever been. This work is difficult work, and it is very tiring, very disheartening sometimes. But what energy I have left, what strength I have left, exists because I believe. It is so much easier to be enthusiastic and eager and energetic about something that you believe in. This is a normal thing in life. If you have a job that you love, you do it better, mostly, on average.
Yeah.
In relationships, in cleaning the garden, mowing the lawn, in everything in life. If you want to do it, if you believe in it, if you know that it's good, you can find something inside yourself. You can find a little spark. I was hospitalized in the USA twice in the first tour that we did in the USA. And the second doctor, was it the second doctor, when he came with the diagnosis after I'd been on the machine, with all the checking the blood samples, whatever, he came, he walked into the room and he was laughing. He laughed at me. And he said, I think the meaning of the laughter was, well, it's not a heart attack and it's not a stroke and it's not this and it's not that. He said it is, how did he put it? Chronic exhaustion and something else. And for him, it was almost funny because it was so bad that I couldn't get out of bed for 1 week before I went to hospital. So he obviously thought, well, this is a serious thing, And then once he'd done all the tests, he said, nah, it's nothing to worry about. You're just so tired. So, that something is difficult when you have to spend a week in bed and you can't get out of bed, and then you have to go to hospital.
Yeah.
We are fighting a difficult fight. But remember our traditions. Our traditions are 732 AD under Charles Martel at Tours. Our traditions are 1529 before the gates of Vienna. Our traditions are 1683 again before the gates of Vienna. We have a tradition as a people, whether you like it or you don't like it. We have a tradition of voluntary self-sacrifice for a greater good. We are a people that is famous, historically famous, not for building the Maya pyramids or the what, because some guy said you must do it. Not for building the Great Wall of China because some guy beat you to death. For building cathedrals that we would never pray in because it would take 100 years to build them. But building them because it was the right thing to do. Sacrificing for that because it was the right thing to do. We come from a tradition and a history and a culture that is unique in the world. Nobody can make the claims that we can make. It doesn't mean that we must hate. It doesn't mean that we must reject everybody else. But it does mean that we must remember that we are worthy. We are not unworthy. Our women are worthy to bear children. Our men are worthy of being men. Our cultures, our tribes, our countries, our nations are worthy of their existence. This we must always remind ourselves, just as those who hate us are telling us that we're no good because we succeeded. It's not even a rational argument. It doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah. Simon, thank you very much. It was quite the experience. I thought a lot about what's happening in your country. I thought a lot about the implications for Slovakia and for all of Europe. And this was very inspiring, enlightening, and I thank you very much, and I congratulate you. I deeply congratulate you on your courage, because what you said just now, I think that it's not just voluntarily sacrifice. It's we have a tradition of heroes. We have the most classical heroes, the greatest idols there ever were, the greatest human heroes, from Achilles to King Archer to everyone else in European history. We are nations of heroes, and I believe you are one of them. And thank you very much for this talk.
It's a pleasure. I would like to leave you with one last word. Remember that our culture has a history of small groups of people doing amazing things.
Sparta.
No offense to any other culture, but I will give you one example. The emperor, the Chinese eunuch Zheng He, went with 1,000 ships to Africa, 1,000 ships, and changed none of history. 3 ships came to South Africa and changed the world. It began with 2 or 3 ships in the USA and so on. This is just one comparison. You can talk about the Hot Gates Thermopylae. You can talk about Vienna and Tours and so on and so forth. There are many examples. I just want to make a point here. We have on our side historical repeated evidence of our ability as a people to, in small numbers, make a big difference. Together, we can change the world. We really, actually can change the world together as a small group. So I say to you guys, don't lose hope. Even if you are 6 or a dozen or 20 or 100, don't lose hope, because you come from a tradition of small numbers of people who together changed the world.
Thank you very much.